Order. Members will have seen on the order paper that the police grant and local government finance reports were due to be considered by the Select Committee on Statutory Instruments this morning. I can confirm that the Select Committee has reported that these reports do not raise any issues within their terms of reference that need to be drawn to the special attention of the House. We now come to the motion relating to the police. I call the Minister to move the motion. Dame Diana Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. With your permission, I would just like to express my condolences to the family, friends and the wider school community at All Saints Catholic High School of Harvey Wilgoose, who was the victim of a stabbing in Sheffield earlier this week and sadly died. I echo the comments of the Prime Minister that schools must be places of safety and learning, not violence and fear. Madam Deputy Speaker, I beg to move that the Police Grant Report England and Wales 2025-6, which was laid before Parliament on the 30th of January of this year, be approved. It is a privilege to present to the House the final police funding settlement for 25-26 and the first opportunity this Labour government has to set out our commitment and support to funding the police of England and Wales. In year one of this government, we are starting the hard work of rebuilding neighbourhood policing and giving them the tools to do the job. In contrast, year one of previous Tory governments in 2010 saw the start of massive cuts to frontline policing, cutting over 20,000 police officers, baking in what many now complain of unfairness in funding, and weakening powers to deal with antisocial behaviour and neighbourhood crime, the consequences of which we now see around the country. Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to commence my remarks by expressing my heartfelt thanks to the thousands of dedicated officers and staff up and down the country for their unwavering commitment and bravery. In the months since I was appointed to this post, I have met many frontline officers from around the country, from Bedfordshire, from Cleveland, from the Met, the West Midlands, Suffolk, Merseyside and Humberside. I have seen and I've heard about countless examples of outstanding police work. In the summer, the police demonstrated exceptional bravery and compassion in the face of unimaginably distressing scenes in Southport. The following day, those same police officers were facing the most disgraceful, violent attacks from criminals and thugs, with 302 officers injured whilst working to keep the public safe. We are incredibly fortunate to have so many courageous men and women devoted to keeping us all safe, pursuing criminals without fear or favour, and this government will never take their service and sacrifice for granted. The police deserve our respect and our support, and the investment we are making through this settlement underlines our commitment to working with the police to deliver the safer streets all our constituents deserve. Happy to give way.
I thank the Minister for giving way, and can I join her in thanking the hard-working police officers and PCSOs in Essex. Last week, the Conservative Police Fire and Crime Commissioner threatened to get rid of all 99 Essex PCSOs who do incredible hard work supporting my community of Harlow. Would you agree? Would you welcome the fact that the PFCC has U-turned on that and recognise the £27 million extra funding to Essex Police?
Grateful to my honourable friend for raising the issue of Essex, and I will come on to talk a little bit more about the funding that is going into all police forces, including Essex. And I am delighted that the threats that were being made about the reductions in PCSOs will not come to pass. All police forces will benefit from this settlement, and I'm going to go on and talk a little bit about that. I will, and then I'm going to move on.
Lady for giving way. She referred to neighbourhood policing. For Norfolk, the settlement means 4 officers on duty at any one time as part of this new settlement over an area of 2,000 square miles. Norfolk's Police Chief Constable, who's also the national lead, has warned that there's a £4 million funding gap for Norfolk. He's going to have to lose experienced police staff as a result. Why isn't the Minister giving Norfolk and other rural areas the settlements they need?
I'm going to come on and talk about neighbourhood policing, but I just want to say to the honourable member, all police forces are getting additional money in this police settlement. In terms of the neighbourhood policing money that's being made available, we are working with all police forces for them to come up with plans about how they can best deliver the neighbourhood policing guarantee in their area. So I'm going to come on and talk about that in a moment. But I just want to get this onto the record, and then I will certainly give way. In 25-26, overall funding for policing will total up to 19.6 billion. Of this amount, funding available to police and crime commissioners for their local police forces will be up to 17.5 billion. That's an increase of an additional 1.1 billion for next year, a 6.6% cash increase. So just so we're all clear, 1.1 billion in addition. But I'm happy to give way.
I think the Minister for giving way. Could she, for the benefit of the House, just clarify how much of that uplift will be taken up by the increased national insurance contributions that have been made by police forces as a result of Labour's increase in national insurance contributions?
So the national insurance increases that were announced in the budget are fully funded in the settlement. I think I saw...
well, and she talks of increasing
the exact figure. I do apologise.
Minister?
I do apologise. If you want the exact figure, it's 230 million that's being given to police forces to cover national insurance contributions. I'm happy to give way.
Thank you. She talks of increasing the draft settlement, but extra funding for Welsh police forces only plugs the gaps left by Labour Welsh governments since reducing the PCSO funding in recent years. Plaid Cymru PCC David Llewellyn tells us that 56% of David Powys police funding now has to come from local residents. Surely the time has come to review police funding in Wales and have devolution of policing on the table.
Well, issues around, for example, the precept in Wales are obviously a matter for the Welsh Government. I think there is a general agreement that a number of members are concerned about the police settlement. It is historic. It's what we inherited from the previous government. I know that the previous government had 2 attempts to try and reform that police formula. And didn't do so. But I will come on to talk about that in a moment. I just want to go through some of the figures so we're all very clear about what's being announced today. So I just set out the 1.1 billion extra that's being made available to policing in the next financial year. That funding that I talked about is based on the assumption that PCCs make use of the full precept flexibility of £14 for English forces. I know it's different in Wales. This measure provides important flexibility, which could result in an additional 329.8 million in funding should all forces choose to fully utilise this precept limit. It's important to make clear, however, that those decisions are ultimately made at the local level. But I do want to come on now to the neighbourhood policing commitment. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, neighbourhood policing is the bedrock of our policing model. Every community deserves visible, proactive and accessible neighbourhood policing, with officers tackling the issues that matter most to those areas. Under the previous Conservative governments, neighbourhood policing was slashed in communities across the country, and more than half of the public now say that they never see a bobby on the beat. Shockingly, that number has doubled since 2010, eroding community confidence and leaving people feeling less safe. Sadly, over those previous 14 years, as I've said, neighbourhood policing was decimated, with the number of PCSOs halved and the number of special constables reduced by 2/3. And that has dire consequences for public safety and public confidence. So over the 14 years of the Conservative governments, too many town centres and high streets across the country have been gripped by an epidemic of antisocial behaviour. We're at the highest levels of shop theft for a generation, and that's corroding our communities and cannot be allowed to continue. I'm very happy to give way.
I'd like to thank my right honourable friend for giving way. Retail crime is one of the biggest issues that businesses across Clwyd East raise with me. I think it's fair to say that under the last Conservative government and how they characterised and deprioritised dealing with so-called low-value thefts is the reason why we're in such a mess, and there's been such an increase in shoplifting, which is now obviously at a 20-year high. I would also ask whether she would agree with me to give thanks to both Usdaw and the Cooperative Party in the work they've done in this area, but would she tell us a little bit more about how this extra funding will help bolster our neighbourhood policing teams so that they can do the real tireless work that they do around making sure both our shops and our shop workers are kept safe?
My honourable friend raises a very important point, and I think that presence, that neighbourhood policing that we're talking about in our high streets and our town centres will be so important in getting to grips with not only the antisocial behaviour but also this rise in shop theft and the assaults on retail workers. It's very clear that the Labour government, this Labour government, want to turn the page and put that neighbourhood policing back into our communities in every corner of our country. Our neighbourhood policing guarantee will see the recruitment of thousands of additional police officers, PCSOs and special constables, equipped with the tougher powers they need to crack down on the crimes blighting our high streets and town centres. And that is why we are doubling the funding for neighbourhood policing compared to the provisional settlement, which was published in December, to a total of £200 million to kickstart this work on neighbourhood policing in 25-26. The impact of good neighbourhood policing on local community confidence and crime prevention can never be overstated, and that is why it's integral to our Safer Streets mission, which is in turn a core strand of the government's plan for change. And I expect policing to make use of this funding to increase neighbourhood teams across every force next year. This increase in neighbourhood policing, alongside the neighbourhood policing guarantee, will strengthen the connections between the police and the communities they serve and clearly demonstrate to the public that the police are responding to local concerns and priorities. Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to now turn to the subject of police officer numbers. We are committing £376.8 million to support forces in maintaining officer numbers for 25-26. Out of this, £270.1 million will be allocated to forces on the conditions that they meet their officer targets. An additional £106.7 million will be provided as top-up grant to support recruitment efforts in 24-25 and 25-26. This funding will be unconditional and distributed based on the extra recruitment each force achieves. I want to also raise, Madam Deputy Speaker, that this settlement represents a significant increase in funding for police forces, but in return, the government will expect all police forces to raise their ambition on efficiencies, drive forward improvements to productivity, and ensure that every penny invested in our mission to create safer streets actually counts. And this means that forces will be required to participate in the recently launched commercial efficiencies and collaboration programme to unlock immediate cashable savings and develop additional opportunities for increased income generation. Our first focus will be on forces signing up to national approaches to buying energy, vehicles, fuel, the need for temporary staff and software licences. We are also increasing firearms licensing fees that have not changed since 2015 and are now significantly less than the cost of the service provided by police forces. The additional revenue raised will be retained by police forces to support the important improvements that are needed in firearms licensing. Now, these are our initial priority areas, but we will be going further, ensuring the foundations are in place to deliver hundreds of millions of pounds of efficiency savings by the end of this Parliament. We will also reduce burdens, tackle bureaucracy and free up resources within policing. Whether that is through better utilisation of AI to rapidly triage and disseminate thousands of digital forensic records, eliminate any wasteful and unnecessary redaction of files, passing between the police and the CPS, or supporting the rollout of enhanced and rapid video responses to improve response times and victim outcomes. Improved productivity has the potential to unlock millions of hours within policing, free up vital officer time for redeployment onto the front line, unlock further savings for police forces and improve outcomes. We will ensure we provide support to forces to measure the benefits of these improvements and ensure that time saved is reinvested into our priority areas, such as the Neighbourhood Policing Guarantee. Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to say a few words about counter-terrorism. The preservation of our national security is the first duty of any government, and this settlement provides essential support for counter-terrorism policing, whose funding will increase by 14% to £1.1 billion to ensure that they have the resources that they need to deal with the threats that we face. In conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, despite a very challenging fiscal inheritance, a black hole of 22 million, we have prioritised investment in the police. We have prioritised investment in the police because we recognise that people cannot thrive unless they feel safe, and our country cannot realise its potential unless the foundations are strong. No doubt there is much more to do, and I have heard the feedback, and I know that some police forces are facing tough decisions to balance budgets, and I will continue to work in partnership with the police in our quest to restore neighbourhood policing and deliver safer streets. I think this is a shared mission to improve the lives of the people that we all serve, to reduce harm and restore confidence, to equip and empower our police for the challenges of today and tomorrow, and to build a fairer and safer country for all. This settlement that we are debating today will aid us in these endeavours, and this is why I'm commending this to the House this afternoon.
The question is, as on the order paper, I call Shadow Minister Matt Vickers.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Before engaging in the substance of this debate, I would like to take the opportunity to thank the brave, hard-working police officers, PCSOs, police staff and volunteers who work tirelessly to protect the public. They work day and night to make our communities safer and run towards danger while others run away. We recognise the huge sacrifices they make, giving their time, their health and, in the most tragic cases, their lives. In this chamber, I know MPs across the House recognise our responsibility to support the police in their work. Therefore, I'm pleased that members have expressed their concerns to the Minister about this settlement. The reality is that the funding settlement put forward by the government is inadequate. Everyone in this chamber who has spoken with their local police force knows that this settlement will not provide the necessary resources, particularly given the inflationary pressures. Last week, when questioned by Nick Robinson about the absurd tax rate on our police forces and the fact that her settlement will cut the number of police on our streets, the Minister conceded that she was not going to pretend it's not challenging for police forces. However, today, she and her colleagues are attempting to present a different picture, understating this settlement's impact on reducing police numbers and the financial challenge it poses to our police forces. Last week, she stated that PCCs and chief constables must make the local decisions about composition of their forces. Will she now acknowledge that her government's decisions have created this impossible position for police leaders? At first glance, the settlement may appear generous in cash terms. However, there is a sleight of hand. The cash increase is not enough to cover the new financial pressures that exist, the biggest of which have been created by this government. The funding will not be sufficient to sustain police forces, and without further action, it will ultimately lead to reductions in officer numbers. Since the funding settlement was announced, numerous PCCs, chief constables and representative bodies have warned the government about the challenges it will create. Why are police forces so concerned? The impact of this year's funding must be assessed in the context of two key factors. The first issue is the government's own increase in national insurance contribution. Some £230 million of this apparently generous settlement will go straight back to the Treasury to pay the government's own tax raid on our own police forces. The government is literally taxing the police off our streets. Economic data has already shown the harm the national insurance raid has inflicted on businesses and jobs, but it has also reduced the financial benefit the police will receive from this settlement. Since the government chose to impose this tax nationwide, it is only right that the Home Office should fully cover the cost of this tax increase for police forces. But now they're claiming that the £230 million, which covers their own tax hike, somehow counts as a funding increase. It's not a funding increase. It's just covering an extra cost the government themselves have imposed on our hard-working police forces. Would this money not have been better spent in due course? Would this money not have been better spent on more police officers or investments in technology to improve efficiency, something this government claims to prioritise, or on targeted interventions? In fact, this sum alone could have funded I
do thank the Shadow Minister for giving way. He, like so many on his side of the House, were supportive of the Health and Social Care Levy, which was a larger and more wide-ranging increase in national insurance than anything that's been proposed by this government. I've just checked his Hansard for the entirety that he was a member of this place. Not once did he speak out against that tax hike, and not once has he referenced police funding until today. What is it about being in opposition that makes him think he now has the moral high ground?
That's a false statement, actually. I definitely have mentioned police funding in this. It's misleading. I've definitely mentioned police funding in this House before. You have a play with Hansard. Let's see. In fact, this sum alone could have funded the recruitment, or at the very least the retention of thousands of officers who could have been out there protecting our neighbourhoods. Instead, it will be funnelled back into the Treasury to cover a host of other public sector pay demands from Labour's union paymasters.
I'm very grateful to the Shadow Minister for giving way. I wonder, would he like to explain how it could possibly be that he sat on these benches for several years and not a word about the 20,000 officers that were lost and the 500 officers that were lost in Cleveland?
So after the last Labour government's spending and borrowing splurge caused the economic crises of 2008, there were cuts that were made. But you know, thereafter, he should be really happy, because thereafter we increased the number of police officers on the streets of the UK to record numbers, 149,679, the highest number of police officers ever on our streets. No, I'm going to make some progress, thank you very much. Some might say that the government, some might say the Minister is giving with one hand and taking with the other. However, given these tax rises, it's clear she's giving with the left hand and taking back with the far left hand. Secondly, previous Conservative governments provided in-year funding for PCCs to cover... I'll take one. You want to intervene? No. PCCs to cover the police... Go on then. You can. I'll take you.
If the Shadow Minister knows what pays for policing and that money comes from the Treasury, and when there is nothing left because, for example, a Home Office that the Shadow Home Secretary was part of, for example, didn't put any of the money for many of the schemes that were in that budget, where do they think the money has to come from?
Taxpayers, the people who go out day and night, work hard, cough up for the national insurance rise, those small businesses battered by the rate relief slashing of your government on leisure, hospitality and retail businesses, absolutely horrendous. Those hard-working men and women out there paying their taxes fund these police officers. Secondly, second big issue of the day with this funding formula, previous Conservative governments provided in-year funding for PCCs to cover the police pay award, which was then added to the baseline, so any increase was on top of the already elevated baseline. By contrast, the in-year adjustment for this year's pay settlement was not added to the baseline, and so about £200 million of this apparently generous increase simply makes up for that omission. So of the money that's been in the 1 point something, but around 430 million of this apparently generous increase actually just makes up for the government's own choices. Adjusting for that, the increase in funding for policing next year is not £1.9 billion at all, but more like 660 million, nearly 300 million less than the last increase under the previous government. This actual increase of 660 million is not enough to meet pay and inflationary pressures. FOI requests from police forces highlight the financial strain, with some forces not receiving the full amount required from the Home Office. This shortfall must then be covered, either by local taxpayers or through cuts elsewhere. I would be interested to hear the Minister for Policing's view on this, given her party were strong proponents of freezing council tax in 2023, a principle that, like so many others, seems to have been abandoned now they're in government. All this means police budgets are overstretched, the forces will inevitably have to make tough decisions. While estimates vary, the National Police Chiefs Council projected in December a £1.3 billion funding gap over the next 2 years, which the National Police Chiefs Council finance lead said would inevitably result in job losses. Other estimates suggest the funding shortfall is closer to £118 million per year, even accounting for the additional funding announced last week. Regardless of which estimate we use, either should be a serious concern for the Home Office and the government. At the low figure of £118 million, given current staff costs, we could see job losses of over 1,800 officers. This is unacceptable. Yes, a Labour government that's borrowing like no one's watching, spending like there's no tomorrow, could still leave us with 1,800 less police officers on our streets. I will give way.
Thank you. I'd like to explore a little bit more the Shadow Minister's understanding of the way that tax pays for things. You've identified what you say is a funding gap. You've also... Sorry, my apologies, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Shadow Minister has confirmed to the House that taxation pays for police officers, and he believes he's identified a funding gap. Could you explain to the House how he'd fill it?
You are completely overstating what you get. Last year, 900 plus million. This year, it is only £660 million. You're completely overstating what you're giving to police officers. The government is completely overstating what's given to... It's wrong. We managed the finances to put the largest number of police ever on the streets of the UK. There is no guarantees from the policing minister that she'll maintain that. I'm going to carry on. There'll be plenty of opportunities for everybody to contribute to this debate, I am sure. Thanks to measures introduced by the Conservatives in government, the total number of officers stood at 149,769 in March 2024, the highest headcount since comparable records begin. You'll have plenty of opportunities to contribute to this debate. I know they don't like the fact, Mr Speaker, but the Conservatives, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Conservatives left office with record numbers of police and thousands more officers on our streets than ever before. All we're calling for today is for the government to, at the very least, try and maintain this number and not reduce it. The reality is that the government is placing police forces in an impossible position. Without cutting officer numbers, how do they expect forces to meet their financial obligations? I know the government has pointed to its intention to recruit new neighbourhood officers, but as we all know, this only includes a relatively small number, just 3,000 new officers. Most of the claimed 13,000 are either being reassigned, are part-time, are volunteers or are PCSOs with no power of arrest. Given the existing budget shortfalls, I'm concerned that this level of recruitment will not be enough. The £200 million allocated in this inadequate settlement appears insufficient to meet the government's stated objectives. Will the Minister be honest and acknowledge that to achieve what has been outlined, officers will need to be reassigned? And if so, can she assure us that these officers will be assigned properly, appropriately? Can she assure us, I'm sure he's got opportunities to come back to me, can she assure MPs that when their constituents ring 999, they won't have to wait longer for an emergency response because response officers have been redeployed to neighbourhoods? Come, you're welcome.
I just thought it might be helpful to the Shadow Minister if I just reminded him, he's right in March 24 that the figures were 149,769 police officers. But actually, in June, when the government was still in power, they'd gone down by 1,232. So there were 148,536. So the numbers had gone down on the previous government's watch.
By the measurements in September, that's not the case. By the time September came, is she going to give us that guarantee that they're not going to go down any further? Is she going to give us that guarantee as a result of her funding? It's not going to go down further. The government has undeniably set well-intentioned goals. Halving knife crime, tackling violence against women and girls are ambitions that will be celebrated across this Parliament and across this country. But what are the actual measures for halving violence against women and girls? Without enough police officers available to prioritise these issues, progress will be far more difficult. Moving forward, will the government commit to fully funding pay increases and ensuring additional tax burdens are not placed on police forces in the years ahead? What has been put forward today does not do enough to provide the resources the police need to tackle criminals in our society, meaning the only winners would be those who thrive in criminality. Thank you.
Point of order, Gareth Snell.
Deputy Speaker, Madam Deputy Speaker, the honourable gentleman suggested that I'd misled the House by suggesting that what I said wasn't true. I would like to be absolutely clear, Madam Deputy Speaker. There are 3 references prior to the election when the honourable gentleman mentioned police funding, and each of them was an obsequious pleasantry about how wonderful the last government was. That is not what I suggested he said.
That is not a point of order, but that is a point of debate. Before we move on to our first contribution, can I remind members, including front benches, not to use the word you. I now call Rachel Hopkins.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And may I start my comments by putting on record my congratulations to Trevor Rodenhurst, the Chief Constable of Bedfordshire Police, for being awarded the King's Police Medal for Distinguished Service. It's well deserved. And like others, may I thank the police officers, PCSOs and all police staff at Bedfordshire Police for their service. After years of campaigning for better funding for Bedfordshire Police, I'm very pleased that this Labour government has demonstrated our commitment to safer streets and more police in our communities by bringing forward this core funding settlement. Bedfordshire Police has been awarded £67.8 million, an increase of 6.6%, as well as £1.8 million from the Neighbourhood Policing Guarantee funding for 25-26. This increase comes after 14 years of Tory cuts and underfunding, which have which have required Bedfordshire Police to cut spending by over £50 million. And I'd like to thank our Labour Police and Crime Commissioner for Bedfordshire, John Tissard, for his commitment to ensuring we make best use of these funds to increase policing capacity and his dedication to tackling violent crime across our county, particularly his ongoing desire to work in partnership with other public services and the voluntary sector with a focus on prevention. Bedfordshire has a diverse landscape and our police cover urban, densely populated towns, including Bedford and Luton, which suffer from crime associated with metropolitan areas. Our county has significant transportation links from road, rail and air, making Bedfordshire a particular hotspot for organised crime, including firearms and drug supply offences. But unfortunately, our police force is also tackling the impact of knife crime. From the period January 2023 to March 24, there were 449 knife crime-related incidents in Luton alone. And in recent weeks, we've seen more violent crime in Luton, with 2 stabbings taking place, one of which tragically resulted in a fatality. Despite these factors, Bedfordshire Police is still funded currently as a rural police force due to failures by the previous government to fix the archaic funding formula. Special grants have been provided each year since 2019 to 20 to tackle the disproportionately high gun and gang crime in Bedfordshire, with a further grant awarded since 2021 to 22 to combat organised crime. And while I can't comment on the Shadow Minister's contributions, I know that myself and many other members from across the House who represent constituencies in Bedfordshire have spoken many times on the funding formula for Bedfordshire Police. Bedfordshire Police are currently awaiting confirmation of the continuation of these special grants, which equate to 5% of their total budget. Announcements are expected later this month, and so I'd urge the Minister to consider the specific circumstances of our police force when taking these decisions, as the impact of these grants cannot be underestimated. And if I may just close by saying how pleased I am to see multi-year settlements for local government coming in, because that provides them with more stability in the partnership they do working with our police forces when it comes to community safety. Thank you.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Lisa Smart.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I rise today to address some of the urgent issues affecting communities across the country. Everyone deserves to feel safe in their home and while walking through their own neighbourhood. For many people in the UK today, that's simply not the reality. The previous Conservative government failed to keep our communities safe from crime by decimating neighbourhood policing, taking officers off our streets and leaving our communities far less safe. Our communities look to the government to step up and fix this by properly funding the officers our communities need, not simply passing the buck to local police chiefs to put up people's council tax instead. My own constituency of Hazel Grove, while undoubtedly the finest in the country, sees crime higher than any of us would want to see, and a force straining to give our community the policing they need. In towns and villages like Marple or Romley, shop workers, as was mentioned by a member opposite, are facing a surge in shop theft, with little expectation that the police will be able to respond effectively. For them, it has become simply part of the job, and that is unacceptable. In recent weeks in Romley, a string of burglaries has hit small businesses, including a pet shop, a nail salon, and even a charity shop. These small businesses are already struggling with rising costs, and many cannot afford to keep taking losses in this way. And the reality is that neighbourhood policing has been gutted. It is no wonder that 6,000 cases are closed daily in England and Wales without a suspect being identified, and that just 6% of crimes reported to the police result in a suspect being charged. The previous Conservative government slashed over 4,500 police community support officers since 2015, leaving fewer officers to prevent and respond to these crimes. And it is exactly those PCSOs who called on the small businesses in my patch to check in after they'd been burgled, and exactly that sort of community policing that victims value. One of the most persistent issues raised on doorsteps in my constituency is the scourge of illegal off-road bikes. Whether that's in Offerton, Heatherley or High Lane, residents are intimidated by this antisocial and often dangerous behaviour. And bike theft is yet another example, with local gangs targeting cyclists, especially teenagers. A resident from Hazel Grove recently shared their fears after 2 violent bike thefts occurred within just 1 week near Aquinas College and on Chester Road. And in Marple, residents have reported bike muggings occurring in broad daylight, children being threatened with knives, pushed off their bikes and having their bikes and phones stolen. Madam Deputy Speaker, these are exactly the kind of issues community policing should be addressing. But after years of cuts, neighbourhood policing teams lack the officers they need to do their jobs effectively. If we're serious about tackling antisocial behaviour, we must invest in more visible policing, ensuring that officers have the time and the resources to act on these concerns. The Lib Dems have long championed the local approach, and we would ensure that more police are on our streets by scrapping the expensive Police and Crime Commissioner experiment and investing the savings in frontline policing instead. We've also been calling for a new national online crime agency that would take over on issues like fraud, online and abuse in an increasingly complex online world, leaving more time for local forces to tackle neighbourhood crime. In her opening remarks, the Minister rightly thanked our police officers and talked about the phenomenally difficult and valuable job they do. The mental health situation within our police force needs attention. Like so many, too many in our society, there are too many police officers struggling to access the mental health support they need. One of my constituents, Louise from Hazel Grove, got in touch with me about her son, who is just 21 years old. As a new police officer, in only 1 week, he had to respond to multiple suicides, and in one particularly harrowing case, a man who had been hit by a train. The emotional toll of such traumatic incidents is immense. Yet, in his station, Louise reports that there are no mental health first aiders, no formal support being offered, and no access to psychological assistance. When her son raised his concerns with her sergeant, the only person who at the time was available to listen, he was simply placed on restricted duties with no promise of further help. This cannot be the standard response to officers struggling with the mental health issues associated with their work. If we fail to support our officers' mental well-being, we will see brilliant, well-trained professionals leaving the force, further weakening our ability to keep communities safe. Now, the Lib Dems have also been clear about our support for tackling rural crime. The NFU Mutual's latest figures estimate the cost of rural crime increased by 4.3% year on year to £52.8 million in 2023 as criminal gangs targeted farmyards and fields looking to cash in on continuing high inflation and ready resale markets domestically and overseas. Rural crime has to be... I will happily give way.
I appreciate giving way. As a vet, I spend a lot of my time driving around the rural areas, working with farmers and livery yard owners in the Meon Valley in Hampshire and the Deputy Speaker's beautiful constituency of Romsey as well. And rural crime is a huge issue. It's common, it's expensive, it is difficult to tackle. But does my honourable friend share my concern that the Provisional Police Grant Report doesn't specifically mention rural crime once?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'm sure my honourable friend accurately represented your own constituency, because if we're creeping, let's all get in on that. My honourable friend, I do share my honourable friend's concerns about the lack of specificity on rural crime. The Minister and I have discussed over the dispatch box questions about rural crime before, and she's right that neighbourhoods are different and neighbourhood policing can approach rural areas, urban areas, suburban areas differently. But I do think all forces should have a rural focus and specificity. My own area of Mellor is much more rural than, for example, Offerton, and the crime profile of those areas will be different. So I very, very strongly agree with him on that. I, in fact, urge the new Labour government to set up an independent task force to produce a strategy on tackling rural crime and implementing that strategy. And my honourable friend, the member for North Cornwall, has pushed for this with a bill he has presented to this House. The government should also extend the Equipment Theft Act to include GPS theft, a crime that contributed to a loss of £4.2 million in 2023 alone, and enforce stricter penalties for livestock-related offences. Madam Deputy Speaker, the issues I've raised today are not isolated concerns. They are the direct result of a decade of government cuts and neglect. And when our police forces are underfunded and overstretched, criminals feel they can act with impunity, and law-abiding citizens are left to suffer the consequences. We cannot and we should not continue to accept a police system where shop theft becomes routine, where young people fear for their safety just going about living their lives, and where rural crime goes unpunished and where our police don't get the support they desperately need. Our officers deserve better support, and our communities deserve the reassurance of visible, effective policing. I urge the government to take these concerns seriously and commit to real investment in neighbourhood policing, mental health support for officers and stronger enforcement to keep our streets safe. Our communities across the country deserve nothing less.
Jazz Athwal.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I thank the Minister for her statement and also for the money that we are going to see, well, the important things. And can I also associate myself with some of the remarks made by my honourable friend from Hazel Grove about community policing, neighbourhood policing being decimated over the last 14 years. And of course, with that decimation comes insurance, motor vehicle insurance rising through the roof, shoplifters marauding our streets without fear, and of course low-level crime out of control. Last time Labour was in government, we were tough on crime and tough on the causes of crime. Following 14 years of the Conservatives' mismanagement, crime and policing has fallen into crisis. Crime has increased, and despite what has been said in this place, police numbers declined. Prisons have crumbled and victims denied justice. Locally, in 2014, the borough I led was home to 5 police stations. Following a decade of Conservative cuts, only a single police station remained standing. Everyone deserves to feel safe. Safe from burglary in our homes, safe from assault on our streets, and safe from violence in our daily lives. In Ilford South, Madam Deputy Speaker, we have all felt the consequences of rising crime. Knife crime in particular has plagued our streets, claiming the lives of so many young people just starting out. People with their whole futures ahead of them, caught up in gangs or victimised themselves. We have seen high-profile cases of domestic abuse where women are murdered and families shattered. Only recently, George Ortega lost his life whilst working at Ilford train station, a victim of violent assault which deprived his family of a beloved father, grandfather and husband. It is vital that the police are adequately resourced to act as both deterrent and enforcers. Without fair police funding, we ultimately accept the decriminalisation of low-level crime and the exponential increase of serious crime. We all know how crime can destroy communities, devastate families, degrade the bonds of our society. And after 14 years of Conservative cuts to policing, closing police stations and empowering criminals, it is beyond time for a change. I welcome the Home Secretary's funding report, which addresses the significant issues of police funding cuts and acknowledges the vital importance of having officers back on our streets. The announcement of 6.6% cash increase in police funding will mean more uniformed officers patrolling our streets, protecting our communities and responding when we need them most. The funding for the Metropolitan Police will support policing across the capital, ultimately making our streets safer. Under Labour, we're bringing back community policing, increasing police numbers and beginning the hard work of restoring public trust. Funding is one part of the solution. To deliver safer streets and improve community confidence, we need a holistic approach, focusing on prevention as well as cure. We need spaces for young people to go to socialise and to be inspired. In Ilford South, I've had the great pleasure of working with Stephen Addison with Box Up Crime, a local organisation which runs boxing clubs, offering young people an escape, an education and a safe space away from crime, antisocial behaviour and gang violence. As council leader, I led the investment in youth centres in Loxford, a leisure centre in Goodmayes and libraries across Redbridge, giving young people places to exercise, to learn and make friends. We also brought back community policing locally, as Labour in government will now do nationally. We delivered enforcement and engagement hubs, bases for police and council enforcement officers to engage with the public and conduct patrols. Affordable replacements for the police stations the Conservative government defunded. In fact, the latest one opened last week. I was honoured to invite my honourable friend, the then Shadow Home Secretary and now the Home Secretary, to launch our very first enforcement hub. And I'm now delighted to support her in government delivering community policing across the country. Today's report on police grants gives us the opportunity and the resources to prevent crime, improve community safety and build confidence in the police. Under this Labour government, the public can rest assured that once again we will be tough on crime and tough on the causes of crime, delivering community policing, fair funding and innovation needed to prevent crime before it happens. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Sarah Olney.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. While I welcome the government's increase of funding to the Metropolitan Police, this commitment does not go anywhere near far enough to deliver what's required for safe policing on the streets of London. The Labour Party were elected into office on the mandate to restore community policing, which was gutted by the last Conservative government. And while the shadow policing minister may well protest his own interest in the topic of police funding, I think there's a more eloquent story told by the empty benches behind him when it comes to their
their actual commitment on this issue, which has been demonstrated throughout their administration. We need to see real action and a real commitment to neighbourhood policing in order to address the ongoing issues with crime and antisocial behaviour that we are seeing across London, and to give the police the tools that they need to restore trust and confidence in our police service. I'm concerned that this grant is not enough to protect current services provided by the Metropolitan Police from further cuts, let alone enough to restore policing numbers and infrastructure to its previous levels. The force is experiencing real challenges in recruitment and retention of police officers, which is affecting their ability to fill vacancies. I receive regular correspondence from my constituents who've passed on their experiences of being victims of burglaries and other criminal activities, and the recurring theme in this correspondence is the difficulty that victims have with ensuring that their cases are investigated in detail and at length by the Met. And now this is a direct consequence of cuts to our forces, as our neighbourhood teams are severely stretched, meaning that the time they can spend on each case is limited. My constituency of Richmond Park used to be home to 3 police stations, but after years of cuts, these have all been closed. Richmond Police Station acted as a hub for our community, and it provided reassurance to residents that they could quickly report a crime or a development in a case to an officer in person. Now, the lack of these police stations in my constituency is causing that connection between the public and the police to be lost due to the reduced visibility of police officers on our streets. Happily.
I thank the honourable lady for giving way. Would she recognise, as I do, that actually the cuts caused by created by the last government towards policing has led to a void of experience in community policing, and actually what we need to get back is that experience, and that's going to take, sadly, time?
I thank the gentleman for his intervention, and he is precisely right. I've had conversations with the local police teams, and what I find frequently in terms of neighbourhood policing is a large turnover of police officers, which really affects an ability for police officers to develop that relationship with their local communities, and that lack of experience can be so telling when it comes to responding to, for example, issues of antisocial behaviour. Indeed, I'll give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. Although I represent a constituency in Sussex, in towns in mid-Sussex, I often knock on doors and discover that there are Met police officers living in my patch. And I vividly remember a conversation with an officer in Burgess Hill last year where he said that the only reason he was still in the police force was out of loyalty to his colleagues. Does my honourable friend agree with me that more needs to be done to boost morale in the police?
I thank my honourable friend for that intervention. She's absolutely right. And when I speak to my local police officers, the officers who are patrolling the streets of my constituency, I find so many times that actually they live quite some distance from the communities that they serve. And this is obviously a direct result of the cost of living in London. But it creates a real problem for Londoners that they are not served by Londoners in the police force. But my honourable friend is exactly right about morale, and that's really got to be urgently addressed. Now, this story is common across London. Over 100 police stations have been closed by the Met, while there's been a 64% reduction in community policing since 2015. However, the Met are now in the position where they cannot sell off any more of their estate to balance their budget, and it's clear that they require a significant influx of funding. Now, the Metropolitan Police are responsible for policing regular and well-attended protests in central London, which requires a greater intensity of resource to police these demonstrations. And in Richmond Park, we have regularly seen our local officers abstracted away from their neighbourhood responsibilities to provide additional support to these events. And this has resulted in a lack of cover on our local streets, which adds to people's anxieties about the lack of policing. Recently, the Commissioner for the Metropolitan Police, Sir Mark Rowley, has warned about a deeply concerning shortfall that the Met are facing, as he was quoted in December referencing a £450 million funding shortfall. The Commissioner warned that if substantial funding is not provided, the Met would be forced to cut 2,300 officers and 400 members of staff in the next financial year. So the funding proposed by the government today is a drop in the ocean of what is required to prevent cuts to our London officers, and this provision of funding is certainly not in keeping with the government's promise to restore neighbourhood policing numbers to their communities, to our communities. Now, while I can't match my honourable friends from Winchester and Hazel Grove's speeches about rural crime in my constituency, we do have a significant police force, the Parks Police, who are there specifically to patrol the royal parks. And they play a really, really important role in keeping crime and antisocial behaviour in in the royal parks across London to a minimum, and while their expertise in their domain enables them to quickly address emergency situations. In response to a survey that I recently conducted, nearly 1,000 of my constituents voiced their strong opposition to any proposed cuts to the Parks Police, as well as providing first-hand evidence telling of times in which the Parks Police helped provide a quick resolution to what could otherwise have developed into crisis situations. So, with all of this in mind, can the Minister provide us with assurances that the new grant funding for our police forces will mean that such cuts to important and valued police departments are not on the table? And I would urge the Minister to go further and really consider the specific demands of the Metropolitan Police and the valuable work that they do right across our city in keeping our communities safe. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Michael Payne.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I begin by associating myself with the remarks of my right honourable friend about the tragic loss of Harvey Wilgoose and extend my deepest condolences to his family. Can I also begin my contribution by thanking Chief Constable Kate Maynell, all of her police officers and staff at Nottinghamshire Police for their important and heroic work they do for communities that I represent in Gedling. And I'd like to begin, Madam Deputy Speaker, by paying tribute to one of my constituents, PC Chris Duffy, and his police dog, Reno. When attending an incident in March 2023, PC Duffy was struck over the back of his head by an attacker in an alleyway, leaving him with a 7-inch wound on the back of his head as he fell to the floor. Notwithstanding what had happened to him, PC Duffy got himself back on his feet and 15 minutes later arrested his attacker. I was delighted, as his Member of Parliament and a lifelong school friend of his, to see him recognised being nominated for a prestigious Pride of Gedling Award last year, and I'd like to pay tribute to PC Chris Duffy and his police dog Reno for their heroic service. Madam Deputy Speaker, thanks to this Labour government, residents in Gedling will be the beneficiaries of a much-needed funding increase for Nottinghamshire Police. I welcome the government's announcement of a total £7.2 million boost in funding for Nottinghamshire Police, a 6.1% increase, meaning more police on our streets and communities across Gedling and more resources for our brave police officers to clamp down on crime and antisocial behaviour. Madam Deputy Speaker, this government is working constructively and closely with our Labour Police and Crime Commissioner, Gary Godden, who has been a tireless champion for Nottinghamshire Police and our hard-working police officers across the county of Nottinghamshire. Himself an ex-copper, he understands firsthand the devastating impacts of crime and antisocial behaviour on communities like the ones I represent in Gedling. This, Madam Deputy Speaker, is in stark contrast to the previous Conservative Police and Crime Commissioner of Nottinghamshire, who spent more time defending her own speeding offences than tackling people offending with speeding on our roads. As we saw, Madam Deputy Speaker, under the last Conservative government, when you cut the number of police officers, it is always the hard-working, law-abiding majority who pay the price. I've seen it firsthand, Madam Deputy Speaker, in Arnold and in Carlton and Netherfield town centres, where lawless thugs have tried getting away with mindless antisocial behaviour. Madam Deputy Speaker, my constituent John has been playing darts on a Wednesday evening in Arnold town centre for over 20 years. He recently told me about the gangs of young people smashing up bicycles outside a local supermarket at night. John said to me it was getting worse week by week, and it was putting people off visiting the area in the town centre. In Carlton, my constituent Louise recently visited a local church to donate school uniforms and was confronted with offensive graffiti daubed across the church walls, leading her children to ask her the uncomfortable questions about what this vile vandalism meant. Graffiti, Madam Deputy Speaker, on the walls of one of our most beautiful churches. And last week, I met Sarah, who is a governor at Warren Primary Academy, a fantastic school in a wonderful community. Sarah and the head teacher at Warren Primary told me of how parents are afraid to let their kids play in a park, Muirfield Park, due to weekly incidents of vandalism of public property, including the burning of park equipment, people carrying knives, and I quote, off-road bikers ripping up the park, wearing full balaclavas. Think about that. Parents afraid of letting their children play in parks because of some lawless thugs and vandals. This is totally unacceptable and must change. Local councillors The community and I have been raising these issues with the Police and Crime Commissioner in Nottinghamshire, as well as the Government. And I hope that the new uplift in funding from this Labour Government for our local police is put to good use in increasing neighbourhood policing and will ensure that this kind of antisocial behaviour is stamped out. Madam Deputy Speaker, on this side of the House, we believe that all crime should be prosecuted. We believe in the need to take tough action on criminals and those who are intent on attempting to intimidate the law-abiding majority. We believe in a zero-tolerance approach to the perpetrators of antisocial behaviour in places like Arnold, Netherfield, Carlton and Warren Hill. Unlike the party opposite, Madam Deputy Speaker, who effectively legalised shoplifting under the value of £200, who slashed the number of police by 45,000 in the first 4 years of office, and then, Madam Deputy Speaker, expected us to thank them for promising the return of only 20,000. Police force numbers, to be clear, to the Shadow Policing Minister, at the end of the last Conservative government were still 2,000 lower than when Labour last left office in 2010. And at the same time, what did we see, Madam Deputy Speaker? A rise in fraud, a rise in knife crime and the continued presence of antisocial behaviour. Madam Deputy Speaker, it will be this Labour government that increases the number of neighbourhood bobbies on the beat by 13,000, introduces a named police officer for every community and invests in youth hubs across our country so that we can tackle the root causes of antisocial behaviour. I, Madam Deputy Speaker, will never ever apologise for a zero-tolerance approach to antisocial behaviour. It is what my constituents in Gedling expect. And I am glad and delighted that this Labour government is working with our Police and Crime Commissioner, Nottinghamshire Police, MPs and local councillors to stamp this out. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Edward Morello.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. While I am grateful for the additional funding outlined in the Police Grant Report, it is clear that it does not go far enough. Police forces in rural constituencies like West Dorset continue to struggle with historic underfunding, and once again this funding settlement falls short of what is needed. Dorset Police will see an increase in funding of from 180.1 million to 191.8 million, a 6.5% rise. However, the national average increase is 6.6, meaning that yet again, Dorset will receive less than most areas despite being one of the most underfunded forces in the country. Dorset receives just £286 per head, well below the national average. In fact, we are the 8th lowest funded police force in the country, and that is unacceptable. The current police funding formula is fundamentally flawed. It fails to recognise the importance of rurality, which means that rural forces like Dorset, which has to police an area of more than 1,000 square miles but has a low population density, loses out in comparison to urban forces. It fails to account for the very real challenges that rural policing presents, including the difficulty of maintaining a visible police force over vast geographical areas. In West Dorset, residents already struggle to see a police officer around their communities, and this funding does little to address that issue. The formula also fails to take account for seasonality and the impact of tourism. In West Dorset, we see a 42% increase in the population during peak holiday seasons, stretching police resources even further. And the financial strain is already dire. Dorset Police faces a funding deficit of £3.6 million last year and is projected to rise to £7.3 million this year. That is even before the rising costs and increased employer national insurance contributions are taken into account. The reality is that much of the additional funding announced will simply go towards covering these increased costs rather than addressing the deep-rooted financial difficulties the force faces. Despite evidence-backed requests submitted last August for an additional £12.2 million in annual funding, the government has failed to provide this essential support. As a result, Dorset Police is forced to make severe cuts, including a 43% reduction in community support officers, a freeze on staff recruitment, the sale of vehicles and building, a restriction on overtime and a halt to all non-essential spending. This will only weaken the ability of our hard-working police officers to keep our communities safe. I urge the Government to urgently revise the police funding formula to ensure that rural forces like Dorset receive a fair and sustainable settlement that reflects the true demands placed upon them. I recognise and I appreciate the additional funding that has been provided, small though it is, and I want to work with the Government to secure the support that police officers so desperately need. This is not just about fairness, Madam Deputy Speaker. It is about ensuring that every community, no matter how rural, has the security and the protection that it deserves. Thank you.
Andy McDonald.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I thank my honourable friend for her statement, and I wish to welcome the almost £20 billion of total funding for policing in England and Wales in today's statement, an increase of up to £1.1 billion when compared to the previous deal under the Conservative government. This is a real terms funding increase of 4.1% and a cash increase of 6.6%. The announcement of the doubling of funding to kickstart the recruitment of 13,000 more neighbourhood police officers is absolutely vital. But policing on Teesside continues to be impacted by the legacy of Conservative cuts. In March 2010, we had over 1,700 officers, but after an initial loss of 500 officers, today we still have around 200 officers fewer than we did in 2010. So I welcome the new recruitment funding announcement announced this week, and I welcome the recent visit of the Policing Minister to the constituency, and I trust that she was impressed as I was by the incredible engagement from police officers across Cleveland, from Hartlepool and from Middlesbrough in particular, but the other agencies and stakeholders there who just demonstrated the complete rejection of those terrible events that we saw on our streets in the summer. I'll happily give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. Can I join him actually first in thanking the Minister for her unwavering support during the Troubles last summer for me, and I'm sure for other members of Parliament whose constituencies were affected. Would the honourable member join with me in congratulating Cleveland Police for their exemplary work in dealing with the issues that happened last summer, particularly as we recognise that some police officers ended the night in Hartlepool in hospital as a result of what's going on. And would he further join with me in reminding all members that temperance in the way that we speak about crime is incredibly important, because not doing so actually makes the job of our police harder, not easier.
I thank my honourable friend for his intervention. He's absolutely right that it is critical that we express ourselves in this place and outside of this place when discussing issues of crime and of social tensions with the greatest care. And it does fall to everybody on these benches and on the benches opposite not to be rushing to social media to try to exploit an already inflammatory and delicate situation. So that obligation is upon us all. But I do share his celebration of the response from the community and from the police in working together. That was truly remarkable. And it was only as successful as it was because the community and the police worked together in that way. And the Minister will no doubt remember a very impressive officer from Hartlepool, from our honourable friend's constituency, that I only know as Coggy, who was the most impressive individual, who took it upon himself, and his colleagues do the same across the Cleveland Force area, to actually engage with young people who had lost their way, who were not engaged. And I think he was telling me on one occasion he had to intervene with a particular young man and just remonstrate him to say that, I went to school with your dad, and he would be embarrassed. And the young man said, no, that's not true. You didn't go to school with my dad. You went to school with my granddad.
We all love Coggy.
But he was a remarkable man. But I want to remark on some of the impacts on my local force, Cleveland Police, and to put on record my thanks to our Police and Crime Commissioner, Matt Story. A big positive for Cleveland is the doubling of the neighbourhood policing grant. That will so help us on our commitments locally and help drive the government's pledges nationally as well. It's clear that the commitment of this government to funding community policing is like night and day in comparison to 14 years of Tory austerity. However, there are some comments that I would like to make, because the funding formula still hurts us in Cleveland. We have the budget of a small rural force with metropolitan levels of crime. We need a formula based on need and deprivation with the kind local government has had. Cleveland's grant is slightly below that of the national average, which means that we have to make up that gap somewhere else. The Chief Constable's analogy is that we have a king-size bed with a single duvet and we're constantly moving it around, but we can't cover everything. For example, in 2010, a neighbouring force with far less need than Cleveland received £10 million more than we do in Cleveland. Today, that gap is £30 million. We also need funding for our Historical Investigations Unit to continue at its current level and not to taper off as has been planned. The unit is doing critical work and has been given excellent inspection reports. The work they're doing is essential to ensure justice for some very, very complex issues. And I'll raise these issues directly with the Minister outside the chamber. However, it is clear that whilst under the Tories, neighbourhood policing was slashed in communities across the country, under this Labour government, we are now recruiting the neighbourhood police officers. We need to help and protect the public and keep our streets safe. And the constituents that I serve in Middlesbrough and Thornaby East will very much welcome that. But I just want to finish with a comment regarding the loss of 20,000 police officers since 2010. It's been remarked in this chamber by the Honourable Member from Richmond Park, prompted by an intervention, about the loss of experienced officers. I cannot think of anything more reckless and cavalier, and I shudder to think of the consequences that have flowed from the loss of that level of experience across our country. It was the most reckless thing to do, bordering on the negligent, and if we were to monetise that in terms of the demand placed upon other public services because of the inability, the lack of presence of police officers where they were so needed, I think, quite frankly, the party opposite should reflect very, very carefully on their record in office and hang their heads in shame.
Yeah. Paul Kohler.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. When it comes to the police, politicians are all too eager to demand more and more while giving less and less. Years of failure and ineffective resourcing from the previous Conservative government have left police forces across the country overstretched, understaffed and unable to focus on the crimes that impact our communities the most. Whilst the Shadow Police Minister spoke about the 20,000 officers his government finally restored, he didn't mention the fact that it was funded by getting rid of 30,000 backroom staff, with officers required to do their jobs. It was no more than a disingenuous conjuring trick in search of headlines. However, Madam Deputy Speaker, whilst this funding settlement represents a welcome increase, it's ultimately a missed opportunity. The National Police Chiefs Council estimates this settlement still leaves a £1.3 billion funding gap over the next 2 years. So rather than improving police provision, it will in fact do no such thing. The situation facing the Met, which serves my Wimbledon constituency, is stark. I met the Commissioner, Sir Mark Rowley, recently. He told me he is still facing a £130 million shortfall and is determined to take a strategic approach to the inevitable cuts rather than salami slicing the entire service. What impact this will have on particular areas is currently unclear. But in Wimbledon, we fear our police station is again under threat. When I was attacked in my home, my life was saved by two brave officers from that station who arrived within 8 minutes of my eldest daughter dialing 999. If Wimbledon Police Station had not been there, I would not be here. Which is why, when the Mayor of London sought to close it in 2017, I took him to court and won. However, despite Baroness Case's review, noting the closure of 126 police stations has contributed to the reduction of frontline policing, the current BCU commander for South West London at a recent Merton Council scrutiny session was equivocal about whether one of the police stations' long-term future could be guaranteed. I consequently raised its future with Sir Mark when we met, and whilst he recognised its importance, was unable to offer any guarantees. It is clear, however, if we are serious about community policing in my constituency, Wimbledon Police Station must be retained. This settlement also fails to address a critical systemic issue. The police funding mechanism is not fit for purpose, as the Home Office acknowledged a decade ago, when the previous government announced plans to reform it, but then, surprise, surprise, did nothing. The National Police Chiefs Council has described the current model as outdated, leading to large regional disparities in how particular police forces are funded, as we've already heard. The Home Secretary should have seized this moment to reform how the mechanism works. Sadly, however, she looked the other way, just like her predecessors have done for the last 10 years. Yesterday, when he appeared before the Home Affairs Select Committee, I asked the Home Office Permanent Secretary, Sir Matthew Rycroft, as to whether he had had any discussions with the Home Secretary, as to whether she was going to reform the police funding mechanism. Yes, he said, but then talked about picking the right moment, as there's clearly a lot of politics involved, before finally admitting he's not sure when it's going to happen. So perhaps the Minister can tell us today. To be clear, I welcome the settlement, but remain concerned the Home Secretary is not using the opportunity to address systemic issues, while continuing to fund follies like the expensive and ineffective Police and Crime Commissioner model. Politics is, of course, all about making hard choices, and I acknowledge the Home Secretary has more than her fair share to make. However, I remain unconvinced she's made all the right ones on this occasion. Thank you.
Amanda Hack.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Minister for her update on the settlement. I start by thanking my Chief Constable, Rob Nixon, for Leicestershire Police, all of his officers and staff for their dedicated service locally. Despite the protest opposite, we all know there were significant cuts into the policing budget, resulting in significant numbers of officers. In Leicestershire, from 2010 to 2016, we saw 550 officers lose their jobs, about 20% of the force. Police forces up and down the country, including Leicestershire, saw experienced officers, PCSOs and police staff leave their posts. The Conservatives, they recognised their mistake, promising to recruit 20,000 more officers, as though we hadn't lost that many already. So under the Conservative plan, we barely got back to where we were in 2010. The Conservatives have a proven track record of making mistakes, promising to fix those mistakes, then failing miserably, looking for somebody else to blame. It's easy to talk about statistics, but this has real life impacts for our communities. In my recent conversations with officers in North West Leicestershire, I was shocked to discover that Leicestershire Police only have 3 teams of 3 road traffic investigators. Those are those that investigate serious traffic collisions for the whole county of Leicestershire of about 1 million people. This means justice for people who are victims of dangerous driving. It takes so much time to resolve their issues and causes more trauma along the way. The suggestion, like many constituents' ears prick up in North West Leicestershire, because there are limited public transport options and currently no passenger rail. Roads are the only way to get around. Our local beat teams are working hard, and it's a pleasure to regularly meet them on the local policing issues that face our residents in North West Leicestershire. However, like so many of my colleagues here today, they have been suffering with an increase of antisocial behaviour on our communities. So I welcome the announcement. It's a huge step forward. leading the way out of the Tories' mismanagement. We need to ensure our communities have visible neighbourhood policing. It's so important, particularly as our rural towns and villages experiences the same levels of crime as in our cities. That visible policing not only makes people feel safer, can act as a deterrent. I'm sure every MP will raise the funding challenges in their own localities. The last 14 years have devastated our public services. Leicestershire's no different. I understand the Minister and the Department uses complex funding formula to decide on the police funding grants, and Leicestershire has had a historically low base. So as a Leicestershire MP, I will always advocate for more resources for my communities and key services, including our police, and will work with colleagues to ensure that this settlement for Leicestershire works for North West Leicestershire and beyond. Thank you.
Luke Taylor.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. There is much talk lately of the crisis in trust in our institutions. Well, there's no greater way to tackle that crisis head-on than by delivering on the basic function of the state itself, keeping people safe. Everyone deserves to feel safe in their own home and walking down their own streets. But for far too many people in the UK today, that's simply not the reality. Knife crime continues to plague our cities. Scammers, fraudsters and burglars are too often allowed to act with impunity. And rural crimes, which the Provisional Police Grant report failed to mention even once, continues to fly under the radar. The net result is that trust is shaken and victims are left picking up the pieces of their lives, devastated by crimes that should have been prevented in the first place. I, along with my Liberal Democrat colleagues on these benches, recognise that the situation this government has inherited is awful. Years of failure from the previous Conservative government decimated neighbourhood policing. Real-term cuts were made at precisely the time when greater investment was needed. And in the context of policing, it should be abundantly clear across this House now that failing to keep pace with inflation is akin to failing to keep pace with crime itself. If it isn't, then allow me to highlight the following. 6,000 cases are closed each day in England and Wales without a suspect being identified. 75% of car thefts and burglaries are going unsolved, and PCSO numbers are down by nearly 5,000 compared with 9 years ago. Madam Deputy Speaker, there is a sense on the doorsteps of my constituency in Sutton and Cheam and across London that crime is being allowed to pay, and that the days of effective community policing have been consigned to the past. So it is vital that this House now gives the police the resources they need to do their job properly. The measures that the government have outlined are noble in ambition but flawed in execution. As the London spokesperson for these benches, I would be remiss not to highlight three things. Firstly, the hiring of more PCSOs in the capital will not in itself address the frustrating situation whereby far too often the officers doing the nitty-gritty of neighbourhood policing, the Safer Neighbourhoods teams, are pulled away from their local beats to assist with major events in central London. This is not an issue that would be immediately solved with the greater capacity these new support officers would provide. It requires a structural shift within the Metropolitan Police towards keeping these operations separate as far as is possible, so that local policing and national security policing are no longer put in tension. And indeed, the Met have themselves sounded the alarm that despite the government's proposals debated here today, they will still be facing a budget shortfall of between £450 million and £130 million. That means that instead of benefiting from new blood, they will instead have to literally decimate their force, cutting 1 in every 10 officers. When I met with my borough detective superintendent a few weeks ago, as we went through his staff list, he would regularly mention a position that will soon be subject to tough decisions. And that's the brutal reality, Madam Deputy Speaker, and one that the figures announced today will not fix. Because officers working in preventative community roles, those that stop kids turning to crime and being sucked into gangs and antisocial behaviour, will be lost to tough decisions. Secondly, the ambitious number of 13,000 new PCSOs nationally will seem foolish if in urban areas like London, the thinning out of trust in the police and uncompetitive salaries means that these recruitment drives flounder. It is vital that the government supports the Met Commissioner in his attempts to reform the police and win back the trust of London's diverse communities. Finally, the government must recognise that the funding mechanism built into their proposals is deeply unfair and amounts to passing the buck onto local taxpayers through the fatally flawed and regressive council tax system. Increasing policing precepts simply drives council tax up. We are under no illusions. The police need this money, but it should be funded through government investment, not increasing the burden on working people. And indeed, the £230 million in this package, simply to offset the rise in national insurance contributions, is unfortunate. They could have reduced the cost of this package by not introducing that foolish tax hike in the first place. Madam Deputy Speaker, I hope this government has listened to the concerns outlined in the House today and will work across parties to improve their plan. No expense should be spared in keeping our constituents safe, and the government ought really to reconsider more sensible ways to make the investments our forces need. Because big banks ought to contribute to the safer high streets we need, not cut and run from them. And social media companies who profit from the sharing of graphic, violent videos of crime. Only today, whilst preparing for this speech, I saw on my newsfeed video of a violent stabbing in Carshalton that occurred last week, flanked above and below by adverts for local companies. It wasn't promoting the crime, but it was profiting from the sharing and the viewing of those videos. These companies who fail to do enough to remove content like that and to prevent online crime ought to contribute to a safer, more reliable online space. So the government must focus the burden of taxation onto them, rather than passing the buck onto the council taxpayer, to raise the funds to fund greater policing, because they too have a stake in safer society. And if the government is so committed to fixing the foundations, then it must understand that these half measures mean crime will continue to undercut the very notion of Britain as a safe place to raise a family and do business. It disheartens the shopkeepers across London who feel powerless in the face of shoplifting, or the tradesmen that I met with on Monday who were robbed of their tools and with them their livelihoods. It unsettles new parents looking for homes and schools, or for pensioners fearing ever more sophisticated scammers. And it encourages and even vindicates those who would seek to undermine Britain's stability. Thank you.
Calvin Bailey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. First, I'd like to thank the police officers and PCSOs of the Metropolitan Police who bravely serve the communities of Leighton and Wanstead. I also want to thank the Minister for her leadership in this area. Her attentiveness and attention to these issues was manifest in her visit to Leighton and Wanstead, where she saw the problems that this additional funding will address firsthand. This visit was valued by our police force, council and constituents alike. More broadly, we welcome the significant investment that the government is making in our police services, which are much needed after a decade in which real terms funding for Metropolitan Police was cut by £1.2 billion. In combination with the actions being taken by the Mayor of London, who has doubled the mayoral funding for policing, this investment needs to enable better policing for our communities of Leighton and Wanstead. I particularly welcome the largest increase in the national and international capital city grant in a decade, which responds to our concerns I have been raising about the impact of police officer abstractions on our communities. At some points last year, a number of our wards had no community response officers at all because of the amount of abstractions taking place. In total, Madam Deputy Speaker, we lost over 26,000 hours of officer time from Waltham Forest alone. In Redbridge, we have areas which have no identifiable community officers at all. Last Friday, I again met with a group of constituents from Leytonstone who are being blighted by a persistent antisocial behaviour and criminality, including allegations of drug dealing, fencing of stolen goods and other organised criminal activity being run out of premises in the local area. I've been working closely with the Community Support Officer locally and the Council's ASB team, both of whom are actively engaged but struggling to make a difference with the resources that they have, and I wish to thank Councillor Limbergy and Sergeant Mabasher for their efforts. When it comes to tackling crime and antisocial behaviour, Labour's commitment to putting 13,000 additional bobbies on the beat in our neighbourhoods is essential for setting the foundations for change. It will give the reforms and better leadership we need the space they need to actually work. On the Redbridge side of my constituency, last week we saw the opening of a community police hub in Woodford, from which officers will cover South Woodford and Wanstead. As we know, Boris Johnson, as Mayor of London, downgraded neighbourhood policing presence, as mentioned by my right honourable friend from South Ilford, and closed Wanstead Police Station in 2013, and closed also the front counter in Woodford at the same time, failing to recognise the value of bricks and mortars for connecting policing with our communities. Thankfully, this is being redressed due to the hard work of the outstanding Labour Council in Redbridge under the leadership of Councillor Cam Rye. This neighbourhood policing presence is seriously needed in the area. The Co-op on George Lane in South Woodford has had at least 30 shoplifting incidents in the last 12 months alone. Increased police numbers and this improved police presence will be essential to addressing this tyranny. And there is good, responsive policing being done across our communities. Yesterday, for example, I bumped into the Territorial Support Group officers in Langthorne Park. I think they were rather shocked to see me, but this is a known hotspot, and it was why I and they were there. They told me that they were acting on information from local people and proactively targeting criminal activity that had been identified. It is this kind of visible policing, backed by strong community engagement, that really helps to restore trust in policing and their ability to protect us. My hope is that there are some early signs of this coordinated work paying off, with a significant reduction in ASB reports in one of the most effective wards during the final months of last year as a result of reduced amount of abstractions. But sadly, too often, when our neighbourhood police engage with serious antisocial behaviour issues locally, all it does is move the criminality to a different location or suppress it only temporarily. To resolve these problems, we need better joined-up work as well as the resources to make it effective. And in this sense, today's announcement of funding for our councils as well as our police is doubly helpful. I'd like to see our council licensing departments working more closely with the police to shut down premises that are being used for organised crime, even where the evidence isn't yet strong enough for the police to make arrests and secure prosecutions. Alongside the government's action on respect orders and more widely, its efforts to strengthen prevention, I believe there's more we can do to ensure these additional resources really deliver a sense of greater safety and peace for our communities. Finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to amplify the point made by the member for Richmond Park. The police must be of the people, for the people. However, in London, there are many structural challenges which prevent this from being so, including pay, which this government has chosen to tackle in the significant pay uplift in the budget, but also housing. When I was a child, I recall Mr. Abbott, our local Bobby, living in police housing. And whilst this might not be appropriate today, similar support is necessary with housing in order to encourage more Londoners to contribute to the peace and security that they hope to enjoy. This grant must be the start of such a journey. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Pam Cox.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I very much welcome this police settlement, and I'll focus my remarks on Essex. From 2010 onwards, the Conservatives cut 350 PCSOs in Essex, and last week the Conservative Police Commissioner announced he was cutting the remaining 99 despite receiving increased funding from this government. I'm very pleased to say that today he's suggesting he's going to reverse that decision following a public outcry and indeed a bailout from this increased police grant. So this is a huge relief to those PCSOs and their families, of course, but also to our residents who they so brilliantly support. It's also a huge relief to Unison, who represent many employees in our policing services, and I'd like to ask the Minister to confirm that she continues to engage with Unison on this and other policing workforce issues. Madam Deputy Speaker, I also need to raise an extremely sad matter in the House today. That is concerning the loss of 6 young lives on Essex roads at the weekend, including 4 in Colchester, my constituency. All 4 of those were much-loved students at the University of Essex. So I would like to put on record a tribute to the police and first responders at that terrible scene. And I'd also like to ask the Minister if she would meet with me to discuss road safety in my area.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Southend and Rochford, as I'm sure most members around the Chamber will know, is an area of immense culture, cultural heritage, vibrant businesses and a picturesque coastline. Last summer we faced high-profile incidents of antisocial behaviour and crime. I would like to thank the Minister for supporting me during that time as a new MP. It was a very traumatic time for myself and the community as we faced, as a community, the antisocial behaviour that was taking place in our city. This is why I was shocked when last week the Conservative Police Crime and Commissioner for Essex made an announcement to sack all 99 PCSOs across Essex. I'm pleased to say that our Labour government has saved the Essex Police PCSOs from Tory cuts. Yeah. In fact, this year, the Labour government is investing a record amount of funding in Essex policing. I hope the Minister agrees that we need police officers back on the beat in local communities, equipped with tougher powers to crack down on crimes, blighting our high streets, and to restore confidence for businesses, consumers, and the local communities that the city centre is a place that people can enjoy. Thank you.
Oliver Ryan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I rise to hugely welcome this police funding settlement on behalf of all of my constituents in Burnley, Padiham and Briarfield, because they know that for far too long policing in this country has been underfunded, overstretched and undervalued. I thank the Home Secretary and the Home Office for bringing forward this vital funding package, an essential investment into keeping our streets safe and ensuring that our brave and hard-working police officers have the resources they need to do their jobs effectively. The report commits up to £19.5 billion for policing in England and Wales, an increase of over £1 billion compared to the previous year. For too long, for 14 years in fact, our police were hollowed out, stretched, with officers having to do more with less. People feeling like the police just weren't there for them, and crimes going unpunished. Now, this isn't a silver bullet, but this increase marks a step in the right direction, ensuring that police forces can meet the growing demands of modern crime and public safety. As crime evolves, so too must our approach to tackling it. Officers today face challenges that go beyond traditional policing. We are seeing increases in violent crime, organised criminal networks and the damaging effects of antisocial behaviour on our communities, especially in Burnley, Padiham and Briarfield town centres. At the same time, police forces must modernise to tackle cybercrime, fraud, online exploitation, which are rapidly becoming some of the most common and yet complex threats we face. Increasing neighbourhood policing and funding was in our manifesto. We said it, we mean it. Tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime. You have, whatever your age, a responsibility to your community. Disrespect that, and we'll come down hard on you. This funding will strengthen local forces, put officers back on the rounds, and go some way to restoring public confidence in policing. This funding increase will benefit forces across the country, and Lancashire is no exception. Our local force is set to receive £284 million in government grants and approximately another £130 million from the precept, bringing in total around £400 £14 million. A £23.4 million increase, Madam Deputy Speaker. Not just talking the talk on crime on our streets, but walking the walk and putting our money where our mouth is. In Burnley, Padiham and Briarfield, residents are calling for a greater police presence, quicker response times and much tougher action on repeat offenders. They want to see and feel safer in their communities. They want to see the difference that this police funding will make. With this increase, Lancashire Constabulary will be able to invest in officer recruitment, improve resources and deliver the kind of policing that local people expect and deserve.
Will the Honourable Member give way?
I will.
Fuller.
I thank the Honourable Member for his contribution and everything he is saying with regards to improved policing on our streets. Something that would massively help my constituents in Chichester is the reopening of the Chichester Custody Centre, because at the moment police forces are having to drive people that they are arresting all the way over to Worthing, which is a 2-hour round trip, taking them off our streets, and instead they're stuck in traffic on the A27, something I would not wish on anybody. Does the Honourable Member agree with me that opening that custody centre would make a huge difference to my constituents in Chichester?
I thank the Honourable Member. Although my powers as a backbencher may be somewhat limited, I'm sure the Treasury bench has heard. Although I do have some sympathy with her, because I do have some sympathy with her, because there is currently a petition. It's quite opportune to mention this, to reopen the Burnley Custody Centre. Because currently police officers have to drive to Blackburn, which feels like a universal way. So I do have some sympathy with her, although I'm currently lobbying my Police and Crime Commissioner as our local councillors, and I would encourage her to do the same. We are having some success and I'm hopeful, but we will see. But this funding, Madam Deputy Speaker, isn't just about more money, it's about better policing. We need police forces that are modern, efficient and equipped to tackle today's challenges. I welcome this government's neighbourhood policing guarantee, which will put more police officers on the streets doing the rounds, ensuring that every community has a named, contactable officer who understands local issues and priorities. This is not just about visibility, this is about building trust, improving engagement, getting local intel and making policing more accountable to the communities that it serves. As promised, we'll deliver 13,000 new officers, PCSOs and special constables, and this will make a real difference to towns and cities across our country. These officers will play a crucial role in tackling antisocial behaviour, shoplifting, street crime, helping to make our high streets and town centres safer for everyone. I should be able to walk into Burnley, Padiham, Briarfield town centres, anybody should be able to walk into those town centres and feel safe at any time. I should be able to know that if I call 999, I'll get a good response time for an emergency service. I should be able to know, anybody should be able to know, that repeat offenders will not be dealt with lightly, and that the kids throwing rocks at buses in Padiham or in Burnley town centre will get a clip round the ear, and so will their parents. Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm not sure if that's policy, but we'll go with that. Madam Deputy Speaker, we seem to be in the middle of a crisis of respect in our young people, in part because of long-term police underfunding. At the end of the day, this funding is about making people safer. It's about ensuring that when someone calls for help, officers are there. It's about ensuring that criminals face consequences for their actions and that our communities feel protected and supported. In recent years, we've seen rising shoplifting rates, with the previous government all but decriminalising shoplifting in small towns like mine, a surge in violent crime, an increase in vehicle thefts. These are not abstract statistics. These are real issues affecting real local people. A well-funded, well-equipped police force means safer streets, faster response times and greater public confidence in policing. For these reasons, I of course support this funding settlement and encourage all colleagues in the House to do the same. Thank you.
Shadow Minister Matt Vickers.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. With the leave of this House, we've heard a great deal today from members across the House about the grant and the impact it will have on various communities. I raised the point I made earlier. We're deeply concerned about the effect this will have on policing across the country. And don't just take my word for it. Listen to the words of police leadership. Met Commissioner Mark Rowley previously said they would be scaling back our ability to tackle serious violence and organised crime. Norfolk Chief Constable Paul Sanford, the National Police Chief Council's lead for finance, described the funding package as challenging and said that cuts were inevitable. One of Labour's own Police and Crime Commissioners, Joy Allen, PCC for Durham, also said the money may not go as far as we would all hope, and that we will have to wait and see what this additional funding covers and how long it lasts. Does the Minister think the £100 million announced will be enough to stop these cuts? Unfortunately, what we've seen so far is this sentiment reflected not only in words but also in the actions of police forces. In Lincolnshire, the police say there is a budget gap of £14 million. To manage this, they plan to reduce the number of police officers by around 200, bringing the total down to 1,000 by 28-29, alongside cancelling the upcoming police officer intake for March this year. Lincolnshire, unfortunately, is not alone. In Essex, the shortfall in the government's police funding settlement led the force to announce plans to eliminate all 99 of its police community support officers, and I'm coming to it, worry not, police community support officer roles, and reduce staff numbers by around 65. Whilst I acknowledge that this was prior to last week's announcement, Essex, though, will still receive £2.2 million. However, Essex Police had identified a £5.3 million budget shortfall, so they're still over £3 million short. While this additional funding is welcomed, it will not be sufficient to bridge the gap. This is a direct result of the funding shortfall. Derbyshire's Chief Constable stated that its budget shortfall of £1.5 million by the end of the current financial year had increased to £5.5 million after the budget. However, it didn't stop there. She said it was compounded further by this Home Office grant settlement in December, which increased the amount the force needed to balance the books to more than £8.5 million. In this case, the announcement last week appears to meet only 18% of the previously announced shortfall. Meanwhile, PTCs across the country, from Norfolk to Thames Valley, and even in my own home force of Cleveland, have repeatedly highlighted the challenges they face while also having to increase the precept. These decisions expose the hollowness of Labour's so-called neighbourhood policing guarantee. How can they claim to deliver it if forces must cut staff simply to maintain officer numbers at the current level? Another aspect of this debate is the decision to increase funding through precept rises. During last year's debate, Labour's then Shadow Policing Minister, the member for Nottingham North and Kimberley, sat on these benches and stated, and I quote, "The government has lifted the cap on the precept so that PCCs can raise it by £13 next year for Band D properties. That in itself is a challenge for people's finances, but it also creates differential challenges across the country." He went on to say, "This failure of leadership has consequences for less well-off areas." Yet now the Labour Party is in government, their stance appears to have changed. This year's precept increase is even more significant than the one announced last year. Like so much about this government, they promised one thing to win an election and do completely the opposite when they're in charge. Given their actions now, will they acknowledge that they underestimated police funding needs when in opposition and seem to be continuing to underestimate them now in government too? In conclusion, of course, we will not do anything to stop the police from getting some of the resources they need. Therefore, we will not vote against this motion. However, I hope that the government recognises that its actions will not only make its job more challenging, but also risk undermining communities across the country. The government has used a sleight of hand to pretend the extra money for policing is more than it really is. As a result, police forces will not have enough funding to meet cost pressures, and cuts to police numbers are inevitable. If the Police Minister disagrees, will she guarantee now that total police numbers will not fall from the March the 31st, 2024 record level, the last national workforce count of the last government? I know my colleagues want to work with the government to ensure forces in their constituencies get all the resources they need to empower police forces. However, we remain concerned that this settlement is a sign that the challenges the Policing Minister refers to will only grow over the course of this Parliament. Instead of a tax raid on our police forces, we should be giving them the resources they need and showing our brave frontline officers the respect and support they deserve. Thank you.
Jess Phillips. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Firstly, I want to express my gratitude to all the members who have contributed to this debate. And before I respond to the points, and I will respond, I will take the opportunity to say a massive thank you to the police officers, the staff and volunteers who work tirelessly every day to keep us all safe, and the contribution they make to our society. That is simply extraordinary, and we're fortunate to have them. I will use this shameless opportunity to give a shout out to Orla Jenkins and Jim Carroll, my own sergeant and inspector, who I feel like live in my office, which is probably not necessarily a particularly good thing, but who are absolutely amazing, responsive, well-known neighbourhood coppers, and it is why it is so important that people actually know the names of these people and can contact them. I don't plan to repeat the top headlines of the settlements we're debating today, as this has been covered at length by my honourable friend, the Policing Minister. However, I will reiterate that this settlement represents a significant investment in policing that will kickstart the delivery of the Safer Streets mission. Neighbourhood policing is the absolute bedrock of British policing, and that is why we have injected an additional £100 million for neighbourhood policing compared to the provisional settlement. This means we'll be doubling the funding to a total of £200 million available to forces to carry on the fight against crime and keeping communities safe. Now turning to some of the specific points raised during this debate. I welcome the Shadow Minister's comments. It seems that he lives in Wonderland, and the way that he today talked about as if we've come from some amazing nirvana with regard to policing and not an actual situation where every single part of our system, whether it's our courts, our police, our mental health services, our housing, has been so utterly degraded that actually all of that work landed on the hard-working police forces that he sought to praise.
Would she give work?
Go on.
Yeah, I was just wondering if she knew how much this national insurance tax rate was going to cost her local police force and those hard-working police officers in her part of the world.
Okay, so I'm not exactly sure how much it will cost the West Midlands Police, but what I do know is that the Home Office is going to give it to them, and that everybody who the talk as if taxes don't pay for our public services. Money has to be raised to pay for our public services. It is an absolute madness. The Home Office is funding their national insurance rise for West Midlands Police and every other. I cannot believe that we are sitting through a time when the idea that our police forces were not completely and utterly decimated, and I will just say there seems to have been a tiny bit of whitewashing about some people from benches over here about some of the role that their party also took in the 20,000 police officers that were taken off our streets. And the Shadow Minister specifically mentioned and questioned the Policing Minister on 999 calls and response officers. And he also questioned how we will halve violence against women and girls with the help of this settlement. And so I want to bring him back from Wonderland into the real world and tell him a story about Raneem Ouda, who in West Midlands Police called 999 13 times on the night she was murdered by her husband. 13 times she had called out to the police. No immediate response. This immediate response that I'm being told has always existed. Oh, this something is going to change. Oh my gosh. I don't know what the system he thinks has existed for the last 14 years is. And so what I will tell him is what we are going to do is put specialist domestic abuse workers in every single one of our police force response rooms because of the failures of response under police forces decimated by the years of Conservative governments. So I am flabbergasted, frankly, by his gall. My husband often says, I don't know why you continue to be surprised. The member for Luton South and Bedfordshire raised the issues of the funding formula, as many people here today have. I know that the policing minister visited Bedfordshire and very much has heard the voices about the particular challenges that they face. The member for Hazel Grove talked about police and mental health and the morale. I went out to Hertfordshire Police recently to see some police officers who are dog handlers, and the dogs were there to sniff out basically hard drives of sex offenders and child sex abusers. And what I noticed from this visit was it was the first time I'd seen a police officer with this amazing dog, Mickey, look genuinely happy for quite a long time. Morale in policing and the health of our police officers, I have to say, has been dreadfully tested over recent years. And I noted how chuffed this bloke was to be doing his job with this dog. The dog was lovely. It piqued we need to make sure we are looking after our police officers, and the policing minister informs me that we are having a very close look in our reform programme to how occupational health is handed out to police officers. The MP for Richmond, Wimbledon, Sutton and Cheam, all together, I'm not suggesting it's one constituency, that would be quite a big constituency, all raised the issue of the Met. Now, the Met, because of its size, because of its complexities, and also the member for Leighton and Wanstead mentioned, as did many others, the issue of police officers being taken away from the front lines in their neighbourhoods in order to undertake not even just national policing of the capital, but national policing sometimes in other areas. I suppose I want to reassure members that the neighbourhood police formula, the funding formula specifically for the neighbourhood policing, means that it has to be spent on neighbourhood policing and shouldn't and can't really be pulled away to other areas.
Does she think that reducing the number of people working in response policing to make up the numbers in neighbourhood policing will it improve or reduce response times?
Minister.
What I think is that we have put £1.1 billion extra into policing, and what I expect to happen across police forces is that we will work with police forces to ensure, and as we have seen today from members in Essex, would you like, is it what you're shaking your head about, sir? As we have seen... Go on.
1.9 billion, actually, as we've heard. Once you take out your national insurance tax rate and you take out the pay rise that you took from the base, actually is more like 660 million, 300 million less than last year's settlement from the Conservative government.
I heard everybody groan earlier from your benches, and by everybody I mean about pardon?
They're not my benches.
I apologise, they're definitely not your benches. The groaning earlier about the black hole that was left, and to the point that the Shadow Minister makes about the uplift in pay, is that this year's settlement, there was nothing put in the budget by his government to increase the pay of police officers. But nothing was put into the budget because that was the way that they operated. It isn't utter rubbish. It's a fact. Anyway, I shall go back to the people who are actually engaging with the debate. To the member for Gedling, I just want to say a massive thanks to Chris Duffy, who sounds like an amazing officer, and also I imagine is probably quite happy in his work because he works with a dog, and that's I think maybe giving every police officer a dog seems to be the answer. Also not a government policy, neither is clipping people round the ear. however much we might want to. The member for West Dorset, and I'm going to repeatedly say this to the member for Middlesbrough as well. I am from the West Midlands Police Force. If there isn't a year I've been elected to this Parliament where the issue of the funding formula hasn't been raised with me, the problems with the funding formula. It is the West Midlands is one of the areas that it affects so deeply, so I massively hear the issue about the funding formula, and what I would say is that one moment, and then I will give way. What I would say is that 2 attempts that the previous government made at looking at the funding formula, both of which abandoned, we felt very much that this year we had to create a stable system. And I'd just like to remind everybody, this is our 7th month in government, but we absolutely hear the arguments about the funding formula, which was not reformed under the last 14 years. We have inherited this. Would you like to give way?
No, I think the honourable lady is the person to give way. But I think on the specific point of the West Midlands, I want to press the Minister, because she is talking about funding in the West Midlands. I'm a West Midlands MP as well. How does she think the whopping bill that the West Midlands Force are going to face on ENICs is going to impact on their budgets? And also, when it comes to money, if she's so passionate about neighbourhood policing, as indeed I am, what assurances will she give to me that the abhorrent sale of Aldridge Police Station, that funding will come back into services for residents of Aldridge Brownhills?
Minister. The first thing I'd say is that it will cost the West Midlands Police nothing, because the Home Office is going to fund it. Then what I would say is that I assume that apart from the amazing world that we've apparently lived in policing for the last 14 years, that Aldridge Police Station was shut down under her government's previous budgets that were given to local areas, which apparently, I'm led to believe today, have been like, milk and honey. So I imagine the point she's going to make is that we have a Police and Crime Commissioner who is a Labour Police and Crime Commissioner, but they only can work with what they are given. Frankly, I'm actually not going to give way. Go on then.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. So I think what the Honourable Lady is agreeing with me, though, is that the closure of Aldridge Police Station has come on the watch of the Labour Police and Crime Commissioner, who for years delayed and delayed and delayed making that decision.
Minister, I don't disagree with that. That is how the budgets is given out. But the amount of police stations that have been closed in the last 14 years of Tory governments is phenomenal. And actually, I believe there was somebody who mentioned the ones that were closed by Boris Johnson earlier when he was the Mayor of London. And also maybe she would have heard me already talking about things about the West Midlands had she actually been in the debate. And the previous Home Secretary, I notice, is coming in now to speak up. But for most of the time, there was no Conservative members in here for any of this debate. I also want to say to the member for Middlesbrough, just massive respect to Coggy, please pass that on to all of them. To the member for Colchester, the Policing Minister wanted me to confirm to you that she has met with Unison last week, and she is absolutely happy to meet with you about the terrible and tragic meet with her for the terrible tragic losses of life in your constituency and wider in the area of Essex. The member for Burnley, we're all looking forward to him reopening the Chichester custody suite. she's now become responsible for. But many members, the member for Ilford, the member for Burnley, have talked about the importance of neighbourhood policing and with great passion about the problems of antisocial behaviour in our areas. There is very few things as members of Parliament that we face more than complaints and failure, I would say, about antisocial behaviour in our neighbourhoods. I understand that I'm not going to do what the previous government did and pretend that everything is world-beating, the best it could ever be, that nothing is ever going to be better than anything they could ever do. I'm not going to... I mean, they are saying from a sedentary position that is rubbish, but literally they used to claim things were world-beating all the time. So I am going to say that we recognise in the Home Office, no, it's all right, their interventions have not been that world-beating, so no, I won't. I just want to say that things are not perfect, that we all think that there should be more police officers, that we all want greater resource on every single street, and every single constituency MP who spoke up with passion just because they want their neighbourhoods to feel safer. And so I understand, I absolutely will.
Thank you, Toll. Thank you for giving way, and thank you, Minister, for your previous explanation of the funding formula. It's something that I've raised with the Policing Minister as well. Seasonality is an issue in my constituency, Bournemouth West. But I'd like to put on record thanks to Dorset Police for doing so much with the little that they do have, including on things like antisocial behaviour, which blight our town. And I would like to invite the Ministers to come see some of the remarkable work they're doing with business and with the Council to tackle some of these challenges. Minister.
I mean, I would absolutely love to come to Dorset. So, again, I think that that's right. When I speak to my police force, and I think that somebody mentioned the idea of a double bed with a duvet, a single duvet moving around it. Some of our forces, whilst there is huge efficiencies that could still be made, actually across forces, some of our police forces do amazing things, and I do absolutely praise Dorset Police for that. Go on then.
Trying to make a constructive point, picking up on what she was saying. She was talking about efficiency. She just said there's huge opportunities for efficiencies to be made, much as the debate has been on funding, when she is signalling that things can be done better. What's opaque to me, not least from the conversation I had with my own Police and Crime Commissioner before coming in, is what productivity targets the government has set and what variation across the 43 police forces they expect to close. Could she say how many police hours she expects to be freed from working more efficiently and productivity gains, or are the actions the government taking adding bureaucracy and red tape and making that harder for police forces to deliver?
Minister.
Okay, so the National Collaborations and Efficiencies programme has been set up, and actually the answer is I don't know yet how many hours, but for example, I went out to police force. I went out to Thames Valley Police Force and saw exactly how many officer hours were being saved by their police force having directly video contact that didn't mean that police officers had to go out 3 days later to somebody's house to take a statement, that it was done in 8 minutes with a victim of domestic abuse rather than 3 days later. And this is something that will now be rolled out to every police force and will lead to huge efficiencies in time and statement taking. As somebody who gives police statements a huge amount of times every month myself, I know how inefficient it is. So actually, I would be lying if I stood here and said it's going to be 16,000 hours for each police force. That all has to be, that will all be in the future and looking at exactly what is going to work and how we can make those efficiencies I have to say, it is a bit galling when people who haven't sat through the debate come in and just want to have a start in the debate. There was absolutely nobody on the Conservative benches for the vast majority, and there are people who have taken part in the debate who, frankly, deserve a bit more respect. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, this government backs the police 100%. And we are grateful for the tireless work that police officers, PCSOs and staff do every single day. We have heard today about some of the crimes that they suffer themselves. This investment is a significant step towards meeting our shared ambition to boost neighbourhood policing and to restore confidence so badly lost and talked about by many people today in the police. This government have prioritised investment in policing in a time of fiscal constraint, but we know there is more to do. We will work in partnership with the police to deliver our shared ambitions to boost visible neighbourhood policing, tackle knife crime, tackle violence against women and girls, and to reform the police, as well as, through efficiencies, make their jobs easier. This government will always give the police the resources and the powers and tools that they need and the support to get the job done.
Yeah. The question is as on the order paper. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.